Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to Milwaukee Veterans for Peace for organizing this, and thanks to all the sponsoring organizations for your ongoing work for peace and justice. I feel very much at home with this crowd. History has written extensively about and celebrated the sacrifices and heroism of European soldiers in songs, poems, novels, books, and even award-winning films. What has been ignored are the sacrifices of soldiers from faraway lands, young men that had nothing to do with Europe's bitter traditional hatreds, but were sent to war by their colonialist rulers or by deceitful promises of power and control. Over 1.3 million pre-partition Indian soldiers fought for Britain in World War I alone. Many died early in the war from cold and pneumonia because they were sent to fight in their tropical cotton clothes, their winter overcoats arriving weeks later. When injured, they received minimal care for fear these brown subjects might develop relations with the white nurses and bring forth an inferior race. Indian and Muslim troops that were recuperating were kept in locked camps under armed guards. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the Middle East and North Africa with no stake in the war were conscripted after British agents like T. Lawrence worked for decades to sow discord and rile Arab tribal leaders against the Ottoman Empire, promising independence and power. It's important to have an honest historical record and highlight the important but forgotten role that Black and brown people played in protecting Europe, and the fact that Armistice Day is for them as well. Yeah. As we reflect today on the enormous cost of war, we need to also reflect on our country's history of xenophobia. The settlers that endorsed Manifest Destiny believed in the superiority of white Europeans over people of color. That included Indian nations, Mexicans, Blacks, and Chinese. The exclusion of Chinese after they had built our railroad system, not before, was a result of hyped up hysteria and a national phobia known as the Yellow Peril. And many laws were passed targeting them. The act remained in place for 61 years until President Roosevelt repealed it. The Chinese dealt with their own Jim Crow America, but few ever mention it. Then in February 1942, an executive order was issued by President Roosevelt that marks one of the most shameful times in American history. Japanese Americans were rounded up and put into internment camps. The vast majority were American citizens. 130,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated. History did finally recognize that this was an act of pure racism and had no military or strategic purpose at all. As we look at the current period of Islamophobia and fear-mongering, the parallels with our short history as a nation are very clear. We have an administration that has dehumanized and criminalized the category of refugee. They have been stereotyped as potential terrorists, thereby shutting the doors to desperate Syrians and others trying to save their families from brutal war. Mexicans and undocumented immigrants from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are labeled as criminals and rapists. This is ignoring the fact that the vast majority of terrorist acts and mass shootings in this country are committed by white men. We had 2 horrific mass shootings in the past 2 weeks. As soon as I heard gunmen, not terrorists, as soon as I heard a question of his mental health status, not his religion or his country of origin, I knew it was a white male. Let's not forget that it was previous administrations also that fanned the flames of Islamophobia and led us into numerous wars. You have to create a boogeyman to justify war to the masses. No one wants to go and kill people that seem decent, have families, and share much in common with us. We end up with immoral wars like the war in Iraq. Have we tallied the unnecessary loss of life on both sides, including our soldiers? For a lie that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Will we sit idly by as our government supports and arms morally bankrupt leaders like Salman of Saudi Arabia in the man-made starvation of 14 million people in Yemen? Are we going to watch as our government imposes brutal sanctions that will lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iranian children, as we did once in Iraq? Are we going to continue blindly arming and supporting Israel in their ethnic cleansing of Palestinians? We continue to allow these things to happen because we bought into the Islamophobic and xenophobic narrative that these people are members of an inferior race and inferior religion and inferior ethnicity. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu once said, as the world watched the oppression of blacks in South Africa, if you do not actively decide to be part of the solution, it can only mean that you are part of the problem. Just last week, we saw what organizing and working together can do, in spite of all obstacles. Let's not stop there. Commit to working for justice and peace in every corner of our country and our world. Let's say no to wars. Thank you.